if you break your arm, an X-ray gives you a clean binary answer.
Yeah, right. Broken or not broken, it's right there.
Exactly. You see that jagged white line on the black background, the doctor points to it, and that's that. We love that kind of diagnostic precision, especially when looking at the past.
Oh, absolutely. But when you look closely at the history of the Quran, a text that millions believe is perfectly preserved down to the letter, the X-ray is, well, it's incredibly murky.
Yeah, in fact, the visual, uniform printed book that millions read across the globe today, it owes its existence not to a pristine, untouched 7th century preservation, but to a 1924 bureaucratic crisis in Cairo over, of all things, grading school exams.
I mean, it is one of those historical realities that completely upends what we think we know. When people first encounter the actual physical parchment of these early manuscripts, the cognitive dissonance can be massive.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to a brand new deep dive. Today, we are exploring the fascinating, centuries-long journey of a world-shaping text.
Right, the historical evolution of Quranic manuscripts.
Exactly. We know that if you follow this topic, you're probably already familiar with the baseline narrative. The revelations ending in 652 CE, the oral transmission, the eventual standardizations.
But today, we are pushing past that tidy timeline. We want to look at where the physical evidence creates serious friction with that standard story.
Right. And our roadmap for this exploration is a newly published paper, actually dated today, August 18th, 2026, by Marc Bates. It's titled The Quranic Preservation Debate: Manuscript Evidence, Historical Critique, and the Promised Plan of Divine Revelation.
It's a really vital piece of scholarship. Bates is cross-referencing traditional Islamic claims of pristine textual preservation with modern paleography, which is, the hard science of ancient writing.
And he's framing this history within a comparative Christian theological critique, which means, just to be super clear to you listening, we are strictly exploring the author's arguments impartially to understand the history of these manuscripts.
Right. We're not taking or endorsing any theological sides here.
Exactly. We just want to understand the physical ink, the parchment, and the timeline as Bates presents it. So let's jump straight into the friction. We all know the traditional account. The first caliph, Abu Bakr, commissioned Zayd ibn Thabit to gather the fragments, the shoulder bones, the stones, the leather scraps.
But the real crux of the standard narrative happens a bit later, around 650 to 652 CE, under the Caliph Uthman.
The famous Uthmanic recension.
Right. So Uthman is facing this huge political and military crisis. Syrian and Iraqi troops are fighting alongside each other, but they're disputing how to recite the text. It's actively threatening the cohesion of the empire.
So he makes an unprecedented administrative move.
He does. He standardizes a single version, sends master copies out to the major cities, and famously orders that all rival companion codices be burned.
And what's wild to me is that these competing versions, they didn't belong to fringe heretics. They belonged to massive authoritative figures who were incredibly close to the origins of the text.
People like Ibn Masud and Ubay ibn Ka'b.
Yeah. And the historical records themselves acknowledge that these weren't just minor dialect differences, right? Ibn Masud's codex lacked chapters 1, 113, and 114.
And Ubay ibn Ka'b's had extra material and a completely different chapter arrangement.
Right. And the traditional defense often frames Uthman's burning of the codices as a simple unification of pronunciation.
But Bates points out that you don't orchestrate the mass destruction of sacred texts over mere accents. I mean, the political necessity of burning rival copies is itself the strongest evidence of deep, early textual diversity.
I was actually trying to map Uthman's actions to a modern equivalent. It's exactly like a major software company forcing a global system update.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. You push the new OS to every device, but to guarantee there are no compatibility glitches, you actively wipe all the legacy versions from users' hardware. You only aggressively delete those competing versions if the legacy code is fundamentally altering the user experience.
If all those early codices were effectively the same, you wouldn't need a fire.
Yeah.
But Bates emphasizes that the attempt to wipe the slate clean wasn't entirely successful. He points out two critical problems with the Uthmanic narrative. First, none of Uthman's original master copies, the exemplars he supposedly sent to Mecca, Medina, or Damascus, survive today.
Not a single one.
Not one. And second, modern traditionalist scholars are increasingly having to address this gap. Bates highlights a 2020 interview with the prominent scholar Yasir Qadhi, where Qadhi actually admits on camera that the standard narrative has holes in it.
Wow. So even with the traditional framework, there's an internal admission that the idea of a perfect, unbroken, letter-level transmission just doesn't align with reality.
Yeah.
But, okay, if Uthman forced the standardization in the mid-7th century, why did variations keep popping up? Bates argues that the answer is baked into the very mechanics of how 7th century Arabic was written.
Right, and this brings us to the Rasm.
The Rasm.
The Rasm is the basic consonantal skeleton of early written Arabic. To put it in paleographic terms, the 7th century Arabic script was profoundly defective.
Meaning what, exactly?
Well, it was essentially a shorthand. The script had only about 16 basic letter forms, but it needed to represent 28 different sounds.
Wait, really? So a single pen stroke could literally be several different consonants depending on who is reading it?
Exactly.
That's like reading an English sentence entirely without vowels, but even the consonants are guessing games. If I draw a vertical line, is it a T, an L, or an I? How did early readers avoid total confusion?
They had to rely entirely on context and their own localized oral traditions. At that time, the Arabic script lacked diacritical dots, which are called ijam.
Right.
So imagine a single sweeping boat-shaped letter form, depending on where you place dots that had not even been invented yet. Mind you, that exact same shape could be a B, a T, a TH, an N, or a Y.
That is wild.
And on top of that, there were no short vowel marks, known as tashkel.
So you're looking at a skeletal outline that could be an active verb, a passive verb, or maybe even a noun. It's like linguistic Rorschach test.
It is a recipe for immense textual fluidity. So over the 7th to the 9th centuries, regional scribes had to gradually supply these dots and vowels to lock down the meaning. The classical short vowel system that we see in copies today wasn't even finalized until around 786 CE.
By Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad.
Exactly. And adding those dots wasn't just decorative, it was a massive interpretive act. A scribe placing a dot above a line instead of below it fundamentally decided the grammar, the subjects, and sometimes the theological meaning of a verse.
Okay, so we know the text was physically evolving for centuries based on the mechanics of the script. But what happens when we take that theory and apply it to the surviving physical parchment?
This is where the historical X-ray gets incredibly muddy.
Right, because when paleographers actually examine the oldest surviving manuscripts, they do not find static, pristine artifacts.
No, they don't. Popular apologetics frequently claim that the massive Topkapi Codex in Istanbul, or the Samarkand Codex in Tashkent, are Uthman's personal 7th century copies, sometimes even claiming they have his bloodstains on the pages.
But the hard science tells a completely different story. How do paleographers actually know those aren't from Uthman's era?
They look at the physical evolution of the book itself. The Topkapi and Samarkand Codices are written in an advanced Kusic script, which has specific proportional dimensions and formatting that simply did not exist in the mid-7th century.
Yeah, they're too developed.
Right. They also feature elaborate verse separators and illumination decorative elements that evolved much later. Paleographic analysis places them firmly in the late 8th or 9th centuries. They are monumental copies from a later empire, not 7th century originals.
Okay, so the supposed master copies are hundreds of years too late. But what about the genuinely early fragments we do have? Bates cites the incredible work of scholar Daniel Brubaker here.
Yes. Brubaker spent years documenting thousands of post-production alterations in these early folios. And we aren't talking about a typo here or there.
Thousands of alterations.
Thousands. His research is meticulous. He identifies insertions squeezed above the lines, deliberate coverings with the new parchment strips, and most importantly, selective erasures.
Erasures?
Yeah, you can see under magnification where a specific word was physically scraped off the parchment, leaving a rough texture, and then overwritten in completely different ink by a later scribe's hand.
I mean, that is undeniable physical proof of an evolving text. The text wasn't dictated and sealed in amber. It was actively being brought into alignment with a developing regional standard over centuries.
Absolutely. And the most dramatic, undeniable example of this is the Sanaa Palimpsest.
Oh, this is fascinating.
Discovered in the roof of the Great Mosque of Sanaa, Yemen in 1972. This manuscript is the paleographic smoking gun. A palimpsest is a document where an older text was washed or scraped off so the valuable animal skin could be reused for a new text.
It's exactly like an old VHS tape where someone recorded a new show over an old one. But if you look closely, you can still see the static and the faint tracking lines of the original broadcast bleeding through the new footage.
That's a perfect analogy. And using ultraviolet light, scientists have been able to read that erased original broadcast, what scholars call the scriptio inferior.
And what did they find?
Well, the carbon dating for the parchment falls right in the mid-7th century. But the erased lower text fundamentally contradicts the standard narrative. It features a different surah sequence and numerous verbal variants that do not match the Uthmanic standard.
Wow.
It physically proves that a non-standard written form of the Quran circulated early on and was actively erased and displaced.
I know anyone following this field is probably screaming at their device right now. What about the Birmingham Folios?
Right.
A few years ago, headlines exploded claiming scholars found fragments dating back to the Prophet's own lifetime. Doesn't that validate the early perfection of the text?
The Birmingham Folios are a perfect case study in how scientific dating methods are often misunderstood by the public. The radiocarbon dating is indeed early. It places the origin between 568 and 645 CE. But Bates emphasizes a crucial distinction. Carbon-14 dates the death of the animal that provided the skin. It cannot date the application of the ink.
Because parchment was incredibly expensive. A blank animal skin could be cured, traded, and stored for decades before anyone actually wrote on it.
Exactly. When paleographers analyze the ink, the style of the Hijazi script, the spacing, the letter forms, it aligns with copies from the late 7th or early 8th century. So they are phenomenal early witnesses, but they do not magically restore the idea of an untouchable Uthmanic autograph.
Okay, let's step back and look at the trajectory here. We have ambiguous 7th century consonants, centuries of scribes adding dots to define meaning, thousands of physical corrections scraped into the parchment, and palimpsests proving rival versions were erased.
It's a lot.
It is. How on earth did we get from that messy, chaotic reality to the seemingly identical unified printed book that millions of people read today?
Well, because the unpointed defective script supported conflicting recitations for so long, the scholarly community eventually realized they had to draw boundaries to prevent utter fragmentation.
Makes sense.
So in the 10th century, a scholar named Ibn Mujahid officially authorized 7 reading traditions. These are known as the Qira'at. Later authorities expanded this to 10 and eventually even more authorized transmissions.
And Bates highlights that these Qira'at aren't just minor dialect differences, like someone saying Tametu versus Tamato. They affect meaning, grammar, and voice.
They really do.
Yeah.
Take the 2 most famous ones. The reading tradition that is globally dominant today is called the Hafs reading. But there is another major reading, the Warsh reading, which is still widely used in parts of North and West Africa.
And they're different.
When you compare Hafs and Warsh side by side, the differences are substantive. In Surah 3, verse 146, the Hafs text reads, fought, in Arabic, qatala, an active verb. But the Warsh text reads, was killed, qada, changing the voice entirely.
Wow, okay.
In Surah 2, verse 140, the Hafs reading translates to, you say, while the Warsh reading translates to, they say. The subjects of the sentence shift depending on which authorized 10th century tradition you follow.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. If multiple authorized readings with different words and grammar exist, how did the modern world become so convinced that only one single identical text exists? We fast forward to Cairo in 1924.
The 1924 Cairo edition. It is perhaps the most consequential event in modern Islamic textual history. But the catalyst for it wasn't a grand theological council.
Yeah.
It was the Egyptian Ministry of Education.
It was a bureaucratic grading crisis. Egypt was centralizing its school system. Students from all these different regions were coming into Cairo, taking standardized Arabic proficiency exams, but they were vocalizing and spelling words differently based on the various regional Qira'at they grew up with.
The examiners couldn't grade the standardized test. They needed a single, definitive answer key. So a committee working under King Fahd established a standardized printed edition, and they made a deliberate choice to lock in the Hafs text specifically, discarding the others for the sake of the Egyptian educational system.
And then the printing presses took over. Massive state-sponsored printing operations, particularly the King Fahd complex in Saudi Arabia later in the century, took this one specific 1924 Egyptian school board recension and shipped it globally by the hundreds of millions.
They effectively drowned out the other traditions through sheer industrial volume.
It created the modern visual illusion of a single, perfect text unchanged since 632 CE. It's staggering that global uniformity was achieved not by a 7th century caliph, but by a 20th century government bureaucracy trying to grade high school tests.
It is a profound demonstration of how print technology shapes our perception of theology. The printing press has a way of flattening history, erasing the messy margins and presenting a finalized, authoritative product.
So we know the text was physically evolving, heavily debated, and eventually standardized by modern bureaucracy. But why does that matter so much? Why is this historical reality so highly sensitive?
Well, Bates argues that the friction isn't just about historical curiosity, it's an existential threat to the theology itself. And this brings us to the late antique context of the text. Bates points out that the Quran did not emerge in a historical vacuum. The 7th century Arabian Peninsula was a late antique milieu thick with Jewish midrash, Christian apocrypha, and Syriac traditions. And the Quran frequently recast these existing stories for its own theological purposes.
The intertextuality is fascinating. Bates points out that the Quranic story about a raven teaching Cain how to bury his brother directly parallels a Jewish text called the Pirk de Rabbi Eliezer.
Yeah.
And the account of Solomon's hoopoe bird and the Queen of Sheba echoes an Aramaic text, the Targum Shini. And the stories of Jesus as an infant speaking from the cradle and miraculously animating clay birds, they have clear parallels in the infancy gospel of Thomas and the Arabic infancy gospel.
But for Bates, the core issue isn't simply that a 7th century text incorporates older surrounding traditions. The existential friction comes from how this messy, interconnected historical reality clashes with the fundamental nature of Islamic revelation. He introduces a concept called inlibration.
Okay, so if I'm tracking Bates's argument correctly, he's basically comparing inlibration to the Christian idea of incarnation. For a Christian, the divine presence entered the physical world as a human body, Jesus. But for a Muslim, the divine presence entered the physical world as a book.
Exactly.
So criticizing the physical manuscript of the Quran for a Muslim would be exactly like criticizing the physical body of Jesus for a Christian. The text itself is the divine presence.
That is the precise parallel Bates draws. Inlibration is the belief that the physical book is the uncreated word of God, an exact replica of a preserved heavenly tablet. If the primary revelation is a book, then its theological legitimacy requires letter-perfect preservation. If that book has a verifiable human history of ambiguous consonants, physical erasures, and bureaucratic standardization, it fundamentally undermines what the book claims to be. The theology shatters if the history is messy.
And Bates contrasts this vulnerability with the Christian paradigm, utilizing a framework by scholar Walter C. Kaiser Jr. called the Promise Plan. And again, to you listening, we are presenting this strictly as Marc Bates's comparative framework.
Right. In Kaiser's Promise Plan, the primary revelation isn't a physical book. It is a person and a historical unfolding of God's promise. It starts in Genesis, moves through Abraham and David, and climaxes in the incarnate word, Jesus.
So within that framework, the Bible's long, well-documented history of thousands of copyist variants and manuscript messiness doesn't threaten the core faith, because the physical book isn't the uncreated word.
Right. It's an inspired human witness to the word in history. Textual transparency, seeing the human fingerprints of the scribes, is all that is required to validate the historical promise. It doesn't need to be letter perfect to be true.
The contrast Bates highlights is striking. One theology requires a static, untouched artifact to survive. The other incorporates the messy human transmission into the very fabric of its historical witness.
It really is a fascinating framing.
It really brings it all home. Regardless of where you land theologically, this deep dive shows how deeply intertwined technology, history, and human devotion really are. Whether you're looking at the missing vowels in an ancient desert script, the deliberate scraping of ink on the Sanaa Palimpsest, or the mechanical thumping presses of a 1924 printing plant in Cairo.
Human fingerprints are all over the preservation of the sacred. History rarely gives us the clean, unbroken white line on an X-ray. It gives us layers, alterations, and human decisions.
Which leaves me with one final provocative thought for you to mull over. If the 20th century printing press created this global illusion of a single, uniform text by mass-producing the 1924 Cairo edition, how will the digital age dismantle it?
Oh, that's a great question.
Right. Yeah. Now that anyone with a smartphone can pull up high-resolution ultraviolet scans of the Sanaa Palimpsest, or instantly compare the Hafs and Warsh texts side by side online, are we entering a new era? An era where the messy, beautifully complex history of these manuscripts can no longer be smoothed over by a printing press?